Hi, Winnie Johnstone here from Keystone Elder Care Solutions, doing another Elder Care Matters video session. These videos are aimed at family caregivers and seniors to give them tips and strategies and support on moving towards healthier caregiving. So today's topic is called It's Okay to be a Reluctant Caregiver. And what we find in the world of family caregiving is that for the most part, people really enjoy being a family caregiver. While they have some challenges or some stresses, there's lots of positive parts of their role that help offset some of those challenges. So I had a friend of mine who was caring for his elderly dad, and it wasn't his choice. It just happened that he was the individual that lived closest, had the most time on his hands, and was in a position where the caregiving role fell to him. And it was a situation where his elderly dad needed assistance. He needed someone to take on quite a number of roles for him in order for him to remain independent in his own home. And I was speaking to my friend about this, and it was pretty clear that there was a lot of old hurts. The relationship was quite strained and had been strained for a number of years. And so to be thrown into that position, as my friend described it, was really challenging. And quite frankly, he was dragging his feet. It was something that he was hoping to avoid or finding some other way of doing it. And so when reluctant caregivers, as we like to call them, find themselves in that situation, they often experience a little more frustration, a little more stress, a little more anger. They can often feel quite resentful about taking on a role that they didn't really want to be in the first place. And that can actually really impact the way they care. At one point in the conversation, this friend of mine said, I feel so mean. I feel terrible about feeling this way. And the best advice I could give him, I gave him three little bits of advice. And the first one is that it's actually okay to feel that way. So it's a role that he didn't want to take on, and how he feels towards it is certainly valid. And he's not alone. There's many individuals that feel tremendous guilt or resentment around being thrown into a role they didn't want in the first place. So my advice to him was, it's important for him to validate those feelings and to understand those feelings are normal. And it's important for him to look at those feelings and how they impact his caregiving. And so the key is to find a way to move from that source of negativity more towards acceptance of the role and how that process is going to take place. Because typically caregiving is not a short-term stint. It's usually a bit more like a marathon. It can go on for upwards of 6 years. So working towards that acceptance piece is actually really important. The second part of advice, or the second piece of advice that I gave him was, and if you ever talked to me before, I'll often use this sentence a fair amount. It's called "make friends with reality." So most of us don't want reality checks. We like to live in our own world, our own bubble, and we like to see things through a certain lens. However, it's also really important that even though he may not want to be in a caregiving role, and even though he's quite resentful, the bottom line is that he's in that position. And there's two ways it can go. He can continue being negative and continue being resentful and frustrated. And what's going to happen is that's going to impact the way he actually cares for his elderly parent. And so my question to him was, or perhaps more sort of the recommendations was, for him to start taking note of when he was feeling negative, or when he was feeling resentful, or when he was feeling anger or frustration. How did that translate on the other end with his caregiving? So did that show up with his dad while he was caring for him? What kind of words did that end up resulting in? Did it end up in more fighting between the two? And that's even just taking kind of note of that and understanding those feelings is really, really important towards becoming a healthier caregiver, because that's the end result. And so the second part to that is finding a way to understand your triggers and, quite frankly, to try not to trigger those emotions while you're caring for that person. It's not always possible. We find ourselves in situations with very complex diseases or Alzheimer's or just pain and loss, and it can become a very emotional transaction between the family caregiver and the person they're caring for. So, but to be aware of it and to understand what our triggers are and what triggers resentment, anger, frustration can make us a better caregiver, because then we can try to avoid those situations so that we're not being triggered. And secondly, to understand around the reasons behind those triggers and to be able to say, okay, I understand the reasons why, and trying to remove that emotional piece from the caregiving piece if that's possible. Sometimes it's not always possible to remove those two. And the last one is for those caregivers to find a way to vent, to find a way for support. And that is very different for very different caregivers. So if you're reluctant to talk about your caregiving experiences, well, chances are you're not going to join a support group, but you might need to make sure that you have 60 minutes of physical activity per day, or that you have some non-negotiables in terms of your commitments to a balance in life. For others, it is going to support group. For others, it's finding a person who understands your situation and to be able to connect with that person and talk about your situation. So the end result is it's okay to be a reluctant caregiver. Not all of us are put into a position where we want to care for a spouse or an aging parent, and that's okay. On the other hand, to be a healthier caregiver, you're of little value to yourself or to the person you're caring for if we're not aware of how our caregiving can, or how our emotions can have an impact on our caregiving. So that's today's session. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll look forward to seeing you again. Bye-bye.